Now, throughout 2020, the violence in northern Mozambique has been escalating, and in November, more than 50 people were reportedly beheaded by Islamist insurgents. The insurgency in Cabo Delgado province started in 2017, and the violence increased after militants pledged their allegiance to the Islamic State in 2019. A leading aid agency says that children as young as 11 are being beheaded in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province. One mother told Save the Children that she had to watch her 12-year-old son killed in this way close to where she was hiding with her other children. Now, more than 2,500 people have been killed and 700,000 have fled their homes since the insurgency began in 2017. Well, to speak more on this, I'm joined by Menzi Ndlovu, who is a Senior Analyst at Signal Risk. Good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yes, good afternoon to you folks. It is a pleasure to be with you guys today.
Now, let's just start with your reaction to these reports that are coming from aid agency Save the Children about children as young as 11 being beheaded, some of them even in front of their families.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, it is quite atrocious, and it is concerning to hear of such events occurring in Mozambique. But in reality, this is not uncharacteristic of the insurgency in Mozambique and insurgencies on the continent at large. This is predominantly driven by two factors. All right. The first is to terrorize local communities as a form of reprisal, and in order to subjugate them. So by killing individuals that are typically perceived to be innocents, militants seek to send a strong message to communities. And very often individuals that are sensible will see such violence occurring, and they're often subjugated, and they're often cowed by such incidents, and they yield to insurgents' demands. And then the second factor that typically drives violence of this nature is to prevent the mobilization of young boys by local community patrols, which are quite prevalent in Mozambique. Now, as we've noticed throughout the continent, and this is a very sad reality about conflict in general, young boys make for good soldiers. I'm sure you've watched movies like Blood Diamond, where young as 8 are mobilized into conflict. And so insurgents will typically come in and seek out boys as young as 11, either one, to stop locals from deploying those boys as potential community protectors, or to recruit those boys. All right. In the case of Mozambique, I think it was the latter, or rather the former, to stop local communities from mobilizing such boys who make for good combatants, who also make for spies, and they're quite useful from a logistical perspective. So by killing them, by targeting them, they can inadvertently weaken their rivals in the conflict, or actors that are standing against them in Cabo Delgado province, in this case being local community protection militias.
Now, in terms of the reasons, you have given some of the reasons that lead to conflicts of this nature. But in Mozambique, specifically in Cabo Delgado, some of these insurgents in one of the videos that they'd posted actually have mentioned that government was being unfair. And that's with regards to the rubies and gas deposits that are in the country, in terms of sharing that wealth with the locals, creating jobs for the locals. So in essence, is that what you think is spurring this continued unrest?
I think, yes, if you look at the fundamental cause of the insurgency and not just the actions of the militants themselves, the insurgency is rooted in economic or socio-economic concerns that you have listed. And that is essentially a lack of development in Cabo Delgado province, a lack of economic opportunity for local youths, and horizontal inequality between different groups. And then you also have an element of radical Islam that has filtered into northern Mozambique. But in essence, historically, northern Mozambique, compared to areas such as Maputo, has been economically marginalized. You have small industries there, but they're predominantly dominated by external actors, and locals have been excluded, and they've felt aggrieved from or for a very long time. And you also have a high incidence of youth unemployment in northern Mozambique. And these factors have kind of coalesced to create an environment where, one, anti-government sentiment is rife, and two, there is what they call in conflict terms ripeness for mobilization. And you've had external and internal actors, some of them criminal actors, some of them radical Islamist actors, come in and exploit these to establish groups such as Al-Sunna, which is currently causing the trouble up in northern Mozambique. So yes, you're correct in noting that the militancy is essentially driven by more fundamental economic and socio-political factors.
And in terms of updates on the current situation then in Cabo Delgado, do you think the militants have actually gained control of specific territories?
That's a very good question. So had you asked me that last year in around November or so, I'd say that the militants were on the up. They had consolidated quite a large swath of territory, including a strategic town in Cabo Delgado province called Mocimboa da Praia, excuse my Portuguese, and they'd also kind of formed a bit of a pincer around the Afungi Peninsula, where the bulk of the LNG industry is centered. But since then, we have seen a very, very strong pushback from the government, aided by private contractors and also by Tanzania up north. Remember, Cabo Delgado borders Tanzania. And this pushed the militants back quite a bit. We've also seen the government initiative target strategic supply lines. They've led so-called leadership capitulation initiative that has taken out key leaders of the militant group, and that has weakened them and resulted in a situation in 2021 whereby there's a dramatic decrease in the number of conflict incidents that we're currently seeing. So at the moment, as we stand, there is a bit of a lull because of those factors, because of actions taken by the government. But that doesn't necessarily suggest that the militants can't regroup and remobilize, especially if some of these underlying grievances are not addressed. So at the moment, the government has the advantage, but it's not decisive.
Well, there are U.S. troops that have recently been sent in to train some of the Mozambican troops. Do you think that this exercise will be successful, especially when we consider that Russia had tried to help before, but actually eventually withdrew its forces because of the dramatic losses it suffered at the hands of these insurgents?
Yeah, so that is a very interesting one. In terms of context with respect to the U.S. engagement, so the U.S. has sent a brigade of its Green Berets, special forces who are experts at counterinsurgency. And what is quite interesting about the U.S.'s engagement is that it's limited. They're not there to fight, they're there to train, which is very important differentiating factors. So they're still allowing locals to fight, but they're equipping them to fight better. And I think that's a far more effective strategy. Not just from a combative perspective, but also from a sentimental perspective. So by not being actively engaged in Mozambique, militants can't turn around and say, hey, there are foreign crusaders on our land, and use that as a mobilization tactic. But in all, I do think that the move by the U.S. can strengthen the Mozambican army's combat capacity. They come with lots and lots of experience, having engaged in multiple counterinsurgency in certain areas around the continent and in the Middle East. And I think that'll be beneficial. And it will aid Mozambique in being a bit more effective in its counterinsurgency and ensuring, at least from a conflict perspective, that they can contain the group. But again, the issue is addressing the fundamental socio-economic and socio-political concerns. You can suppress them for a limited amount of time, but as long as those factors that lead to radicalization are not resolved, we can see the same issue crop up in a few months. So yeah, it's kind of mixed at the moment, I'd say.
Well, let's leave it there for this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us, and we do hope that conflict will be resolved sooner rather than later. That was Menzi Ndlovu, who is a senior analyst at Signal Risk.